Son gave up the ghost in his house in Berkeley Square, and a spirit came to his bedside and gripped him by the hair. A spirit gripped him by the hair and carried him far away until he heard, as the roar of a rain-fed ford, the roar of the Milky Way, till he heard the roar of the Milky Way die down and drone and cease, and he came to the gate within the wall where St. Peter holds the keys. Stand up now, Tomlinson, and answer me loud and high. The good that you did for the sake of men, or ever you come to die. The good that you did for the sake of men on little earth so lone. And the naked soul of Tomlinson grew white as a rain-washed bone. Well, I had a friend on earth, he said, that was my priest and guide, and well would he answer all for me if he were at my side. Well, for that you strove in neighbor love, it shall be written fair, but now ye wait at heaven's gate, and not in Berkeley Square. Though we called your friend from his bed tonight, he cannot speak for you, for the race is run by 1 and 1, and never by 2 and 2. The wind that blows between the worlds, it cut him like a knife, and Tomlinson took up the tale and spoke of his good in life. Well, this I read in the book, said he, and that was told to me, and this I thought that another man thought of a prince in Muscovy. The good souls flocked like homing doves and bade him clear the path, and Peter, he twirled the jangling keys in weariness and wrath. You've read, you've heard, you've guessed, he said, and the tale has yet to run. By the worth of the body that once ye had, give answer. What have ye done? So I'm going to stop right here and say two things. First of all, for those of you who are worried, this whole sermon is not going to rhyme. Second of all, for those of you who are wondering, that's the great British poet Rudyard Kipling. But in some ways, it could be the great apostle James, because like Kipling here in Tomlinson, James is very keen on this whole what have ye done sort of thing. In fact, he has this very famous section in the book where he kind of uses a term that's sort of become a 4-letter word to Christians, works. It's 5 letters. And that's because so much of the modern Christian church has talked about faith and belief, and you're saved by faith, you're saved by grace, and works don't matter. And that's certainly part of the Bible, but this is part of the Bible too. And to all the people who wish James just weren't there because he's kind of inconvenient. And by the way, I'm talking not just weird pastors with strange haircuts on TV late at night. I'm talking about people like Martin Luther didn't think the book of James should have made the cut for the Bible. But I say too bad, because James is our kind of guy. I mean, I don't know if apostles drink beer, but if they did, James would be the guy you could have a beer with. He was a blue-collar guy. He could walk in almost any church in Pittsburgh and feel right at home. Now, we don't know specifically about what he did for a living, but chances are he was a carpenter because his father was a carpenter and his brother was a carpenter, and that's pretty much the way it was done in those days. You know his father, his name was Joseph, and you know his brother, his name was Jesus. And that to me is just really incredible that James decided to follow Jesus in the ministry. And you might think, well, of course he did. It's his older brother, he would. But the reality is, much of Jesus' family tried to ignore him, or even some of them tried to tell him he's crazy. So not all of Jesus' family followed him. In fact, we know really only James did. And James was the younger brother, and I don't know if we have any other people who had older siblings here, but I had 3 brothers, 2 of them were older. And this just is remarkable that James followed Jesus, because and I don't care if Mary is a saint, at some point she turned to James and said, I never had this problem with your older brother. Jesus never did this. And James, oh yes, Jesus was perfect. That must have just been really hard growing up in the shadow of Jesus. I mean, I got that, and believe me, my brothers were not perfect. But the fact that James then followed him in the ministry tells me not only something about Jesus, but something about James. That he was able to put all that behind. And that also tells me something about his book. Because James knew things nobody else did. The other disciples walked with Jesus for 3 years. James got carpentry lessons from Jesus. I mean, he got to see him in every aspect of the life. And it's almost like his book is screaming to us, listen, I understand that Jesus was brilliant, but it's not his mind that I followed. I understand that Jesus could communicate better than anybody else, but it wasn't his speeches that made me follow him. If Jesus just talked the talk, I would have been like the rest of the family. but it was the fact that Jesus walked the walk that made me follow him. And that's what he's talking about. And so this kind of contradiction starts in the Bible, where we have Paul, and we'll talk about him a little bit, who wrote this famous section in Romans, which talks about how faith is all that matters. And then we have James's section, which comes a few chapters later in our Bible anyway, where we're saying, no, that's not it at all. It's works. And it seems like there's this tension here. And we have a tendency sometimes to run away from tension, but the Bible is supposed to have tension. And the reason for that is because if everything about God you could understand, God would be too small. God promises us there's going to be things about him we don't understand. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts. My ways are higher than your ways. And so when you see things in the Bible that kind of like, wow, that's hard, don't run from it. Run into it. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to run straight into this controversy, this argument between James and Paul. And I know that doesn't sound fun. Great. Let's talk about a 2,000-year-old argument between two religious dudes. But stick with this, because I believe that understanding what James is teaching us will actually change your life. And I don't mean just it'll change your spiritual life or your prayer life or your Christian life. I mean it will flat out change your life, especially if you're kind of feeling like these guys.
It's like, how many different ways do we have to say, I give up, say uncle, say mercy before life stops wailing away on us? I mean, we are getting pounded.
You know, I feel like our whole generation are sheep that's been sold a bad bill of goods. Like we were told, go to college, get good grades.
Well, you didn't go to college.
I'm saying in theory, in concept, our generation was told that you go to college, you get a job, you get a mortgage, and here we did everything the way we were supposed to, and what do we get for it?
Actually, I think they're right, although not necessarily the college part, about we've been sold a bill of goods a little bit because the Americanized version of Christianity has taken the teeth out of Christianity, and I think it's time we put that back. So we're going to talk about that. But before we get to James and Paul, we have to go back all the way to Genesis and talk about Abraham. And that's because both of them are going to reference this story. Now, this is a story that all the Jews would have known very well because it's part of the Jewish tradition, but we're a Gentile church. And I want to make sure that we kind of do a little bit of a level set here so we're all on the same page as we walk into that. And I also want to do what we like to do here a lot, and that's step into the story and try to make us feel it. Because a lot of times we read these stories like they're these cartoon characters, and they're not. They're flesh and blood. They're real, just like us. So we're going to talk today about Abraham. Now, this was a very famous thing was on recently, the Bible, the story of the Bible. Some of you may have caught that, and so you're kind of ahead of me a little bit. But just try to put that aside for a second. But Abraham came along in Genesis. Now, this is after Adam and Eve fell and after the flood and all that. And what's happened is mankind has kind of split up in these little kingdoms. And they're almost clan-based because you basically huddle together for protection. And there's these little groups all over the place. And what you didn't do was venture out of your little group. Because if you did, you'd probably get killed. You need to stick around your family, your friends, and they kind of huddled together, if you will, in all these little tiny, you can call them kingdoms or settlements or whatever. And so that's where Abraham is when the story of Abraham picks up. And God comes to Abraham and says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to pick up and I want you to go. And I'll tell you where to go on the way, which is astounding. But he promises him a couple things at the same time. He says, I am going to make your name live forever. And by the way, the fact that in 2014 I'm talking about Abraham proves that God keeps his promises there. But he also says, I'm going to make you a mighty nation. And this must have really appealed to them because at the time they had no children at all. And Abraham was 75 years old at this time. No kids. And God says, if you pick up and go, I will make you a mighty nation. So Abraham picks up and goes, which is just an amazing, amazing faith. So he goes on this journey of amazing faith, and along the way, his faith falters from time to time. And I think that's great, because so does ours. We can pick up and we can start off on a great journey in faith, and somewhere along the way, the faith falters. That's what happens to Abraham. He does some things that are truly just awesome faith, and he does some things that are totally embarrassing. Like this one section in Genesis 22, they're coming in the land of a warlord. He calls himself a king. And Abraham's afraid that the king is going to come and kill him and rape his wife, Sarah. So he comes up with a plan. He says, tell them you're my sister. You might still get raped, but at least I won't get killed. This is Abraham's plan here, right? So he's kind of got this idea. And this is certainly not one of his highlights of his faith journal. But this is real, because as he kind of goes through, they have these moments. But they're going through all the way until they get to the promised land, and they're settled in, and everything's great. And Abraham's in his late 90s at this point, and they have their land, and they're prospering, and they're looking out, and they said, this is great except for one problem. We have no kids still. 20-some years later, no kids. It is hard to see how you're going to be the father of a nation when you're not even the father of a baseball team. I mean, he doesn't have enough people to play catch with. He's got nobody. And so Sarah and Abraham do what a lot of us have tendency to do here when we step out in a great work and we start with great faith, and God just seems to be late. So he says to Sarah, they say, God needs our help. Clearly, God has forgotten about this whole child thing. So we're going to help him out. And this is something we have to watch and guard ourselves against, because it's so easy to do. Oh man, we've been doing Spirit Chapel for months. By this time, we should be totally full. Maybe we should start serving breakfast as part of the thing. Maybe that would help them out. Maybe that would bring the people in. Or maybe the Wednesday night service would go better with beer. Pizza and beer and service. We could do that. And so you start thinking of all the ways. People say, yeah, that sounds good. We got the pizza place right next door. You start looking at that and you say, God needs help. He told us to do this thing, and we're doing it, and he's late, and he needs help. And so they concocted this plan, and I love this plan because it's so human, because not only is it a plan, but it has plausible deniability built into it. They decide Abraham's going to go to his tent like he does at night and turn off all the lights. And Sarah is barren. That's been proven by 70-some years of trying without kids. What they'll do is they'll send her maid up to the tent. But the lights are out, you see, so we have, I didn't know that was her. If it doesn't work or if somebody catches us, we can say, we didn't know. But the plan does work. The maid goes up and she gets with Abraham, and 9 months later, they give birth to a boy, and they named him Ishmael. And so now Abraham and Sarah are saying, great, we've got this now. We're good. We can get back to the business of building a nation. And then a few years after that, by Jewish tradition, they're to consecrate Ishmael, and they're to pray over him in a ceremony, and God is to bless him. And so they're getting ready for the service, and Abraham goes off to give God his cliff notes to help him out before the service starts. He says, now, we're going to do this, God, and I know that Ishmael maybe wasn't what you were thinking, but hey, we've got him now. We're on track. All we need for you to do is come and bless him. And God says, no. Because when I told you that you were going to be the father of a nation, I meant it. And I meant Sarah was to be the mother. And that was my plan, and that's still my plan, and I'm still going to do it. And I love what happens next in the Bible, because when you read the Bible, it sometimes seems so unreal, but this just seems so real to me. The Bible says Abraham fell down laughing. Come on, wouldn't you? He's 100 at this point. He's like, are you kidding me, God? This isn't going to happen. And he falls down laughing. But notice it says he said in his heart. He didn't say it out loud. Instead, he tries to talk God into blessing Ishmael out loud. But of course, God knew his heart. And he says, this isn't going to happen. But God always has a last laugh. And about a year later, a boy is born to Sarah, and they named him Isaac, which is also great because in Jewish language, and they always, especially in the Old Testament, they try to name children based on what they were promised or what they were to be. And Isaac means he who laughs, which I just think is just terrific. They recognize this is how he was born. Probably when it happened, both Abraham and Sarah were laughing. Okay, God says, well, we'll try. Let's just laugh about it. So Isaac is born, and this is just must have been an amazing thing. I mean, he's so old. He's so given up on this. So has Sarah, and along comes Isaac. And I also believe that names matter to people in the Old Testament. I believe Isaac was just one of those kids who laughed all the time. Have you met those kids? There's little kids, and they just have a smile on their face all the time and laughing. And this must have been such a joy to Isaac's heart. Finally, here we go. My kingdom has started as one person. But I'm so happy about that. And then some time passes, and again, we don't know exactly how much time, but God comes to Abraham and says, you love that gift I gave you? Abraham says, I love this gift. He says, do you love the gift more than you love the giver? Well, I don't know where you're going with that, God. Where I'm going is I need to test you. I need to make sure you love me more than anything else in the world. If I'm going to make you the kingdom that's going to bear my name, you have to prove that you are worthy of that, so I'm going to test you. And here's the test. I want you to take Isaac, your only son, and I want you to go where I send you again, in no directions, just start going. And when you get where I tell you to go, I want you to build an altar, and I want you to sacrifice him to me. Now, we read that and we kind of think, well, this is the Isaac dedication ceremony. You know, we're going to dress Isaac in white robes, and the clan's going to gather around and pray for him. This is the Isaac sacrifice ceremony. He's going to tie him down, and he's going to slit his throat with a knife, watch the blood run out until the eyes go lifeless, and they're going to turn light on fire for atonement for the sins. This is the Isaac sacrifice ceremony. Now, as I read that in the Bible, and as I say that now, and I can kind of feel everybody going, what is this? This question has to come up. What kind of monster of a God would ask this of a father? And this is some of the things, again, sometimes you get these points to the Bible, and like, wow, this is harsh. You know, but it's in the Bible. And why is it there? Well, there's three things I kind of want to say about this, and one's a spoiler alert if you all don't know where the story's going. But first thing you need to understand about this is it was common in those days. Almost every culture around Abraham had as regular part of their services children sacrifice. In fact, it was so common that years hence from here, when Moses comes along, God has to pass a law to stop Israelites from doing this on their own because they start doing it. It's called firewalking. They actually start sacrificing their children to show the people around them they're as serious about their God as they, as the pagans are. And God has to tell them to stop that. So it was very common in that time. The other thing was, this is just a test. And you have to understand this is just a test that God's giving. But the third thing, and probably the most important thing, is this is exactly what God does 1,000 years later. He takes his only son, and he sacrifices him for the sins of all of us. In fact, slitting Jesus' throat would have been a mercy compared to what God let his son endure. So you have to understand that what God is asking of Abraham is nothing more than God wasn't only willing to do, but that God would do. So moving forward again, spoiler alert, Abraham passes the test. We're going to come back to this in a little bit because this is the story that both James and Paul talk about. But before I leave this, I want to ask a question. This was a test, right? Why? Why would God test Abraham? In fact, why does God test anyone? And what I mean by that is God knows everything, right? He knows what's in our heart. He knows the future. Why would a God who knows everything require a test ever of us? We see scriptures like Proverbs 21:2. Every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the heart. The scripture has talked about Abraham said that in his heart, but God knew he said it in his heart. God knows the heart. In Matthew, when Jesus comes, he says you're going to be judged by what's in your heart. If you look at a woman with lust in your heart, it's the same thing as committing adultery. So God knows the heart. God knows the future. Why in the world would he ever have to do a test? And I'm going to stick a pin in that. We're going to come back to that later. All right, before we get there, we're going to go right now back into Paul's account of this story. This is in Romans chapter 4, where Paul's basically talking about Abraham and this. And he says, look, what can we say about Abraham? In fact, if Abraham was justified by works, then he could boast about it, but he didn't. And what does the scripture say? Abraham believed, which is also having faith, in God, and that was credited to him as righteousness. What he's saying is Abraham was righteous not because of what he did, but because of what he believed. Faith made him righteous. This is Paul now. Now, Paul's an interesting guy, and he's making the point here that Abraham was faithful, and that's why God was pleased, and that's why he was righteous. And it's hard to argue with Paul. I mean, Abraham has what I would call the parachutist faith. You don't have one foot in the plane and one foot in the sky. When you're a parachutist, you are all in. You got everything in the sky, and if that parachute doesn't open, there is no plan B. And that's the kind of faith that Abraham shows here on that mountain with his son. So you certainly have to say that he had faith. He had great faith. And you also have to understand who Paul was, because all his life he had been raised to believe that it wasn't faith, it was works. See, we kind of forget where Paul came from. Paul was a Pharisee. In fact, Paul wasn't just a Pharisee, if you listen to Paul. He was the best Pharisee ever. I mean, he says, look, if anybody thinks they have a reason to boast, not as much as me. I was circumcised on the 8th day, which is really important according to law. Of course, Paul didn't have anything to do with that, but his parents took care of that. He's from Israel. He's from the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. And concerning the law, he says, I was a Pharisee. And concerning the righteousness which is in the law, I was blameless. So he says, I know something about this. I was the top person ever. I guess it's not bragging if it's true. Paul says that I was it. I was the most righteous Pharisee there ever was. And the Pharisees kind of get a bad rap, of course, because they're sort of the villains in the New Testament, and Jesus calls them, clever things like snakes and vipers, so you can understand why we have this opinion of Pharisees. But don't misunderstand, the Pharisees took all this very seriously. By the time Paul was here, he would have memorized the first 5 books of the Bible. Memorized. There are names there I can't even pronounce. He had it memorized, right? He knew Scripture inside out. He knew the law. He knew exactly where he stood. And that is why he always felt the burden, because the other thing is, he knew this law, and he also knew that law made him miserable. And he knew, even though he was supposed to be the most righteous of all, and deep down he knew this is a sham. And so when he came along and he saw that what we have is we have the faith, and the faith in Jesus, basically Jesus comes and says, what you do doesn't matter anyway. What matters is what I did, and what you need to do is have faith in that. It was a lightning bolt for him. He's like, oh, this is great. Well, all I need to do is believe in Jesus, and his entire writings show that. Everything he had, every book he wrote, somewhere he snuck in the grace of Jesus and faith, and that's all that matters. He talks about it all the time. And what he does is he kind of does what a scholar does in this thing where we see this incredible act of faith. He takes that and he splits it in half and he parses out the faith and says, this is the part that mattered. See, that's what scholars do. They kind of look for the essence of something, and they can get very intellectual about this. And my father passed away recently. He was great at that. You could have talks with him, and boy, he got esoteric sometimes, just because we're looking for that one little thing in there. And this is what Paul did. He was a trained lawyer, and he knew how to do it. And then we come back over to James, and James comes by and he says, you know what? You cannot take the act of faith and split it and say faith matters. You just can't do that. And I kind of get the impression that James kind of had the same opinion about some scholars that we do. Do you remember this guy? It's like, well, I didn't lie because it all depends what your definition of the word is. This is what a scholar does. They argue about the definition of the word is, and James comes by and says, that hurts my head. You can't do that. You can't take the act of faith, split it out, and take the act away from the faith. You can't do that. And then he goes, he says, you have to understand that faith by itself, if it doesn't have works, is dead. This is like James is saying, listen, I understand that faith is the fire of our soul. But that fire better have heat. Or what good is it? And this is what he's saying. He's not saying works trumps faith. He's saying you have to have the two together. And then the funny thing is he goes on the next section. He starts talking to all those people who just want to get along. If you read through the Bible, when he gets here, he's like, yeah, and he could almost, like he's writing, I can almost sense what they're going to say next. And he says, someone will say, well, you have your faith, I have faith, you have works, and we all get along? And James says, no. Tell you what, you show me your faith without works, and I don't even know how you do that, and I will show you my faith by what I do. And he comes back and says again, faith without works is dead. So now he goes back in the very same story. He says, you want proof of this? Let's talk about Abraham. And the funny thing is this debate kind of is in the Bible, our Bible, but in all reality, Paul and James would have never read each other's letters. James wrote his first, so it's kind of our debate, not theirs. They probably would have gotten together and had a big laugh over how confused we are by it, because they both thought they were saying the same thing. But he comes back and he says, look, our father Abraham was justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar. His faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect. The scripture was fulfilled which said, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called a friend of God. And he ends up by saying, you see, this man was justified by works and not by faith alone. And this is what gives some people who just want to talk about faith and belief a hard time, because he's flat out saying that's not true. But the real important part is this one. Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works, faith was made perfect? And this is kind of a key. So let me go back now to that question I asked earlier. Why does God test anyone? What's the purpose of that? Why would God test us when he knows the answer? Well, let me ask this. Why is a test given? Now, when I was in school, I was convinced tests were given to ruin my weekend. But let's put that aside and assume that wasn't the reason tests are given. The reason tests are given are always to prove something. Always. That's what a test is. It's to prove something. But to prove to whom? Well, there's two people involved in this scenario, two beings involved when Abraham and God have their conversation about being tested. One's God and one's Abraham. Well, we know the test wasn't for God's sake, because he knew entirely what was going to happen. So the only conclusion that you can get out of that is, and this is I think what James is coming back to, the test wasn't for God. The test was for Abraham. And when I started reading that, I remember when I read that, I thought, why would the test be for Abraham? And then it occurred to me, and this is just a belief, I don't have a scripture to back this up, but I believe Abraham didn't know what he was going to do on that whole journey. I think all the way on that journey, he wasn't sure how this was going to end and what he was going to do. And I don't say that as a theologian, I say that as a father. Because I became a father late in life. I should have warned you about this, Em. It's a great picture. Shh. I became a father late in life. You know, I was in my 30s, and we had come to the conclusion we were never going to have children. And, Emily came along very quickly. I went from not having a child in my house to having a child in the house in 4 weeks. So, wow, that's a fast gestation period. So she came along. And what no one told me, though, oh, it's going to be great, it's joy, you'll have a baby. And that was joy, but no one told me that along with this joy meant I would not have a minute of sleep for an entire year. I mean, ever. See, Emily was bottle fed, which means anybody could feed her. And since I was the light sleeper in the family, that meant me every 2 o'clock, every 4 o'clock for a solid year. And I remember about the end of that, I was at my breaking point. And I remember praying this, I'm not kidding, I prayed this prayer, God, I don't need a bigger house, I don't need a better job, but please, dear Lord, one night of sleep, just one night of sleep. Give me one night of sleep. And about that time, she does actually start sleeping through the night, and then about 18 months, we got kicked into the terrible twos. Now, some parents are groaning. We know the terrible twos, right? And it starts sometime around 18 months, and usually they call them twos, but they last well into the threes. And during this period of time, they basically do the opposite of whatever you tell them to do. And they're getting big enough you can't really carry them around anymore. But as soon as you put them down, poof, off they go, And so you're sleeping now, but you're still tired because you're chasing them around everywhere, and it just never fails. And then about the time that ended, the 4 set in, and that was my time. Age 4 and age 5 was my favorite time as a father. And the reason why is because she stopped with rebelling against everything, and she became inquisitive, Dad, why is this? Why is that? And we'd walk around, hand in mine, and she'd ask me these questions, and I'd explain things to her, and I was making half of it up, But she didn't know, and so I just felt like this wise father, And it was just a great time. I loved the years 4 and 5 of the childhood. And then, of course, school comes, and they go off to school, and you're suicidal because you wonder what happened to their childhood, and it's all gone already. But I was thinking about all this as I was reading this section, because Christian belief is that Isaac was about 5 years old when this happened. Now, Jewish belief is it was later than that. They're triangulating from some other documents. But according to the Bible, Christians generally believe that Isaac was about 5 years old when this event happened. And I was thinking about what it'd be like to be the father of a 5-year-old. Just that great time. And so Isaac and Abraham are going off on a trip. Now, you know that Abraham was a very important man and he had a lot of things going on, so he wouldn't have had as much time to spend with Isaac as maybe he'd like. And so when they go up and they're going to go on a journey, and it's kind of a secretive journey, you know, he doesn't tell anybody. I believe he didn't tell Sarah because Sarah would have stopped him. So, you know, I can't tell her. And she'll take the child and run away. So he kind of gathers all this up, and Abraham says to his young men, as they kind of get someplace where God says this is the place, he says, you stay here with the donkey, and the lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we'll come back to you. So he doesn't tell anybody what they're doing. Now, you know Isaac at this point is excited. Oh, he's going on this whole trip with Dad, with the men, you know, big guy now, 5 years old, he's the big guy. And now he and Dad are going off alone. You could just imagine what he thought. You know, they're going up the hill with the donkey, and you could see him like, oh, Dad, give me the firewood. I'll carry the firewood. You know, I've got this. I'm the big boy now. You know, I can do all this. So they're going up the hill, you know, and maybe Abraham reaches out, and Isaac puts his little hand in that laughing, you know, giggling guy. He's just such a happy boy, and they're walking up the hill together. But Isaac's smart, and he's kind of looking around as they're going up the hill, and he says this. He says, Father, we're doing a sacrifice, right? I see the fire and the wood, you know, the knife. See the knife there? Where's the lamb, Dad? Where's the lamb? And this is the moment, I think, because at this moment as they're walking up the hill, and that bright-eyed child that he loves so much says, where's the lamb? Can you imagine the knife that went through Abraham's heart? Because he knows there is no lamb. I don't think he can even tell his child, there is no lamb. I'm going to tie you down. I'm going to kill you to please my God. And I just, at this moment, I just think that as they're walking up there, tears in Abraham's eyes, this is his prayer. God, is there any other way? I want to obey you. I want to do what you said to do. Is there any other way? I'll slit my own throat, Lord. Anything but Isaac. Please, Lord, is there any other way? And I believe this battle went all the way up the hill. This is why I believe God tested him. Because he needed Abraham to see what was in his heart and what was truly important to him. But there comes a tipping point in all of this, where Abraham walking up the hill just gets to the point, he says, you know what, I don't understand this. I can't understand this. This makes no sense to me at all, but everything I've ever done in life that I've gotten blessed for is because I obeyed God. And I don't get this, I don't understand this, I don't know what's going on here, but I'm going to obey God. And that tipping point happened. And that's when he ties him down, and he puts him there, and he lifts up that knife, and that's when God sends the angel. He says, stop. Stop. Abraham, I'm sorry I had to put you through this. I'm sorry you had to go through all of this, but I had to show you what I already knew about you. I had to show you why I chose you to begin with, because there aren't many fathers who would do this. I tell you something, Abraham walked up that hill with a checkered past as far as faith goes, but he walked down that hill the first inductee in the Faith Hall of Fame. Because later in Hebrews, Paul lists them, and he's there. And we never see a wishy-washy faith after this point. After this point, Abraham knows what he believes, and he is strong in it. And it just changes everything. And then God says this, by myself I've sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this thing, and not just faith, you have done this thing, I will bless you. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven and the sand on the seashore. Your descendants shall possess the gate of the enemies. Your seed of all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. God finishes the blessing that he started 25 years ago. And he lets him know, this is why. So now we come back and we look at James. And what's he saying here? Do you see faith was working together with his works, and by works the faith was made perfect? The man was justified by works and not by faith alone. And this is the important message of James. He doesn't throw out faith, but he's saying without faith, works is dead. But the beauty of this is, in the Bible, it's a reciprocal truth. In other words, if faith without works is dead, faith with works is alive. This is a formula, folks. James is giving us, James, Jesus' brother who lived with Jesus and saw things. He saw this. He says, listen, you want faith? Don't ignore the works. Embrace them. Because it's works that make our faith strong. That's what he's saying. So how's your faith doing? I mean, if someone were to come and say, hey, how's your faith? What would you tell them? Can you pray and believe? You know, when your children go off to school, you're scared to death. When the economy goes boom like it's going all the time, like a rocket going up and down and blowing up, do you have faith? God's in charge. Do you live in fear? How's your faith doing? And again, that comes back to what James is telling us. He says there's a formula here. You want stronger faith? It's easy. And then Paul, by the way, speaking on faith, says this, taking the shield of faith, you'll be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked one. He's saying, we're in a battle here, and faith is your shield. Okay. Who wants a weak shield? You're going to go out marching against the enemy with a shield made out of cardboard? I don't want that. I want something that's going to stop those fiery darts. And so this is what James is trying to say. Do you want a strong shield? Do you want that faith in order to be able to withstand the enemy? Well, there's an answer to that. And the problem is that in America, we've kind of forgotten that. Now, I want to make sure that I don't misstate something here, because I'm talking about faith and works, and that kind of gets mixed up. Because people say, well, but you don't need anything but faith for salvation, right? True. That's a true statement. When Jesus is on the cross, the thief beside him who acknowledges him as the Lord Jesus, Jesus says to him, today, you're going to be with me in paradise. And it's important to realize that from that moment, the thief doesn't do anything but die. He does nothing. So of course, I'm not saying that Paul's wrong. I'm saying you need James to complete it. Yeah, of course, your faith is your salvation. But the problem is, if that's all you have, you end up with a puny faith. If you say, boy, all we ever want to do is believe, and we're just going to sit back and wait for God to come back, you're in for a very disappointing life. And we breed this in America. I don't know how many, I know there's people from all different churches here and everything, but this has bugged me from like almost my whole life. So I have to mention this. How many of you have been in a church where the preacher gives this great sermon, you know, fire and brimstone and salvation message, and at the end of it, here's how it ends. All right, I want everybody to bow their head and close their eyes. Now, with every head bowed and every eye closed, is there anybody who thinks they might want to be a Christian? If so, just slip up your hand. Don't anybody look. You know, just lift up your hand, and I'll point out, okay, I see that one. I see that one. Have you been to these services? This generates puny faith. And then they tell you afterwards, we're going to say a little prayer, okay? Those of you who said this, we're going to say a little prayer here. And you don't have to say it out loud. Say it in your heart. But God will be our little secret. Does this save you? Well, according to the Bible, it does. But what you have at this point is a puny faith. It's not a faith that is going to serve you well in the battles that's coming. You have a papier-mâché shield, and the enemy is firing real arrows.
Aren't you tired of asking for just enough to get by?
Yes.
Yeah, aren't you tired of asking for just enough to get by? And that's what we're talking about. It's like, aren't you tired? What's the minimum I can do to get by? Really? I tell people this all the time. You know, when Charles Lindbergh was designing his plane to fly across the Atlantic, he did not go to the guy and say, what's the smallest engine I could get by with? You know, let's push this. No, you want the best. When you go into battle, you know, what's the thinnest armor that I can get? No. Give me the stuff that stops bullets. Give me if you have something that stops a cannon shell, I'd like that one, please. Yeah. This is what Paul's saying when he's talking about the faith shield. Now, here's the other thing about this that you have to understand. The reason God does this is he wants us to participate in his great work. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but have you ever seen a parent who calls their kid over to help them lift something? Have you ever seen that? You know, oh, come here, help me lift this. And kid comes over, you know, and he puts his hand on it, and dad's lifting it. The kid's like all dramatic, you know, and he's not even doing anything. You know, the dad's doing it all, but the kid gets up and down, Mom, did you see that? You know, see how strong I am? This is the picture of God, right? He says, come here. I want you to help me do this. Why? Because he needs your help? No, he's God. He doesn't need your help. He wants us to be involved in that, to build our faith. Because our faith is perfected through works. Our faith grows every time we do something with God. That's how our faith grows, by doing. And that's what Paul's really saying, and that's what James is saying. So I'm going to encourage everybody as we kind of start this next phase in Spirit Chapel. We laid out the vision last week, and a lot of people say, wow, that's an amazing vision. How are you going to do that? I'm not. I don't know how we're going to do that. I just know, like I said last week, that a big God is insulted by small dreams. And the vision that he gives, he will make manifest. You know, God will do it. I don't know. I have no idea how he's going to do everything that he's laid on our hearts to do. I just know he's going to. Everything that God plans to do, he brings to pass. And we have a chance to be that kid helping him pick up the tire. And every time we do that, our faith grows. So that we're able to withstand a lot of stuff that's going on in this world. So again, think about this. Pray about who you know that should be here to hear about this. Let's bring them. Let's start stepping out on faith. We're going to have a prayer meeting that's going to be starting here. Come to that. And when you pray and the prayer gets answered, nothing builds faith faster than answered prayer. And it's important to make entries and journal entries, and remember that, because the enemy will come back later and say, that never happened. You go back, no, I've got that. I remember that. It's all part of the Christian walk. Faith and works goes together. Would everybody please pray with me here?